The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the sky in deep hues of purple and gray. As Alice, Ben, and Riley arrived at the overgrown grounds of Mercy Hill Asylum, the hospital loomed ahead, a dark monolith that seemed to swallow the fading light. Its cracked windows staring back at them like empty, accusing eyes. Alice stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath to calm the anxious flutter in her chest. She'd been fascinated by Mercy Hill's dark history for years since she was a child. Hearing local rumors about the lost patients and mysterious experiments that supposedly went on behind those cold walls, she adjusted her camera bag on her shoulder and turned to her friends. "This place, it's even creepier in person," Ben muttered, eyes fixed on the towering asylum. Though he was skeptical of ghosts, he couldn't deny the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. The silence was unnatural, too thick for an evening in the countryside, and he felt as if the trees themselves were watching. Riley, the most superstitious of the three, hugged herself and shivered. "I don't know about this, guys," she whispered. "I mean, exploring an abandoned hospital at night. This is how horror movies start." Alice managed a small smile, though her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her flashlight. "That's why we're here, right? We've been talking about this for years. And we're not just here to scare ourselves. We're documenting everything, showing the world what's really inside." She glanced back at the asylum, feeling the weight of its dark history pressing on her. The trio gathered their equipment, cameras, flashlights, and a spirit box and moved toward the entrance, where the grand wooden doors were chipped and weathered by years of neglect. Vines twisted up the walls, encroaching on the broken windows. Alice reached for the rusted handle, and with a slow, painful creak, the door opened. As they stepped inside, they were met with a gust of stale, cold air that carried the faint, nauseating scent of decay. Dust floated in the narrow beams of light from their flashlights, swirling around them like ghosts. The foyer was enormous, with high, vaulted ceilings and cracked marble floors. Hospital beds and medical equipment lay scattered across the floor, left behind in the chaos of the asylum's sudden closure. The walls were lined with old, torn wallpaper, once a soft green, but now a sickly shade of gray. Graffiti covered the walls, words scrawled in every language, with messages like, "Do not enter," and "They never left," painted in bold letters. Riley shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. "Who would even come here to leave graffiti?" she whispered, her voice barely breaking the silence. "People looking for a thrill. Like us," Ben replied, though he couldn't mask the slight tremor in his voice. "Except they probably didn't have the guts to stay long." Alice took a deep breath, steadying herself. She raised her camera and began filming, the whir of the device adding a small bit of normalcy to the eerie surroundings. "We're here at Mercy Hill Asylum," she said softly, her voice echoing in the empty foyer. "Tonight, we'll be exploring the halls where patients once lived and died, looking for any evidence of paranormal activity." She lowered the camera, glancing at her friends. "Ready?" They nodded, though Riley's gaze darted around, her fingers trembling around her flashlight. The plan was simple, split up to cover more ground, each of them taking a different floor. Ben would stay on the ground level, exploring the common rooms and patient wards. Riley would brave the basement, where the morgue and operating rooms were. And Alice, naturally, would head to the third floor, the psychiatric wing. Before they split up, Alice took a moment to recount the hospital's history, as if saying it aloud would fortify her against whatever they might encounter. Mercy Hill Asylum was built in 1920, meant to be a place of care for people who society deemed unfit, she said, her voice steady. But rumors started to spread about Dr. Hartwell, the hospital's head psychiatrist. They say he was obsessed with pushing the boundaries of medical science, experimenting on his patients, performing surgeries without anesthesia, all in the name of progress. She shuddered slightly. After he vanished, the asylum shut down almost overnight. People claim they hear screams from the building at night, and that the spirits of those lost here still linger. Riley looked like she wanted to bolt, but Ben placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's just stories," he said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Ghost stories, to keep people from coming here. Nothing's going to happen." Alice gave a final nod, meeting each of their eyes. "Remember, we regroup in an hour. If anything happens, use the walkie-talkies." They each took one, the devices cold and heavy in their hands, as though they could feel the weight of the silence that surrounded them. They each took a deep breath, and without another word, turned to their respective paths. Ben's footsteps echoed through the deserted halls as he moved through the first floor. His flashlight cast long, thin shadows across the cracked walls, revealing fragments of the hospital's former life. Hospital beds with rusted wheels were pushed against the walls, and an overturned wheelchair lay in a corner, its seat torn and frame bent as if someone had tried to escape in it. Ben walked past a series of small examination rooms. Each one was in a state of decay, with broken medical equipment and smashed glass littering the floor. In one room, he found an old patient chart hanging on the wall. It was faded and yellowed, the ink smeared, but he could make out some of the words. Patient number 194. Diagnosis unstable. And then something scrawled over the text in black marker. Gone, but not forgotten. He shuddered, stepping back from the chart, and continued his exploration. As he turned a corner, a faint noise caught his attention. Soft, rhythmic thumping, almost like footsteps. He held his breath, trying to ignore the fear creeping up his spine. He convinced himself it was just the wind. Or maybe Riley or Alice nearby. The sound grew louder, closer, and he turned, his flashlight trembling as he scanned the empty corridor. Nothing moved, and the silence settled back over him like a weight. Ben let out a shaky breath. "Come on, man. It's just an old building. Nothing's here." He was saying it more to himself than anyone else. He moved into the next room, an old children's ward. Tiny beds were arranged in neat rows, each with a dusty, decaying toy left behind, a teddy bear missing an eye, a doll with matted hair, a toy truck with faded paint. The room was filled with an eerie quiet that seemed to amplify his every movement. As he stepped further in, he noticed something odd. Scratch marks on the wall. They were low, as if made by a child, each line jagged and desperate. At the foot of one of the beds, he found a small, handwritten note on a torn piece of paper. It read, "Mommy, I want to go home." Ben's heart pounded in his chest, and he stumbled back, his flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the empty halls, breaking the silence with a jarring, metallic clang. As he bent down to retrieve his flashlight, he caught a movement out of the corner of his Aja shadow. darting from the doorway into the hall. He jerked up, shining his light into the corridor, but it was empty. Only the silent, decaying walls greeted him. Ben felt his skin crawl. His fingers tightened around his flashlight as he hurried back into the hallway, eager to leave the children's ward behind. Riley made her way down the staircase to the basement, each step creaking beneath her weight. The air grew colder as she descended, thick with the smell of mildew and rot. Her flashlight struggled to pierce the darkness, and she felt the weight of the building pressing down on her, as though it resented her presence. The basement was a maze of narrow hallways and tiny rooms, each one darker and more oppressive than the last. She found herself in a small room with steel gurneys lined up along the walls, each one covered with a dusty white sheet. The sight made her stomach twist. This was the morgue. She moved slowly, her eyes darting around the room, her fingers clutching the flashlight so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She could almost feel eyes on her, though she was alone. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling only grew stronger. She turned to leave, but stopped when she heard a faint scraping sound behind her. She spun around, her flashlight flickering slightly. She moved the beam across the gurneys, and her breath caught as she saw one of the sheets moving, as if something was shifting beneath it. Riley froze, unable to look away as the sheet continued to twitch and ripple, as though something trapped beneath was struggling to get free. She backed away slowly, her hand trembling as she lifted her walkie-talkie. "Alice, Ben, are you there?" Only static answered her. She was alone. Riley's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she stared at the gurney. The sheet lay still now, but she could almost feel something watching her, waiting. Gathering her courage, she took a hesitant step forward, her flashlight illuminating the dusty, wrinkled sheet. She reached out slowly, her fingers hovering just above the edge. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run. But something, a twisted sense of curiosity, maybe kept her rooted in place. Just as her fingers brushed the cloth, the sheet twitched again, as if something were moving underneath. Her hand recoiled instantly, and she stumbled back, tripping over a fallen clipboard on the floor. Her flashlight clattered from her grip, and the light rolled, casting eerie shadows across the room. In the dim glow, she saw the outline of something moving from under the sheets, lowly at first, then faster, like a body struggling to rise. The sheet shifted, as though something or someone was trying to sit up. Riley scrambled backward, her heart pounding. Fumbling for her flashlight, she managed to grab it just as the sheet fell flat and the room returned to its deathly silence. Trembling, she shone her light around, illuminating the room's rusted, dilapidated walls and the rows of silent gurneys. Nothing moved. The walkie-talkie at her hip crackled, breaking the silence with a sudden burst of static. "Riley, this is Ben. Do you copy?" She grabbed it, pressing the button so hard it hurt. "Ben, I'm in the basement. I think I saw something. I'm at the morgue." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Stay calm. I'm on my way down." Relief flooded through her, though it was mixed with an unsettling awareness that no matter how fast Ben could reach her, something was lurking, hidden in the depths of the hospital basement. She stayed frozen, her flashlight fixed on the gurney, dreading what might happen if she looked away. Finally, she heard footsteps approaching from the stairwell, echoing in the narrow, winding corridors. Ben's familiar voice called out to her, and she felt her fear lessen, just slightly. He appeared around the corner, his face pale, his eyes scanning the room. "Riley, are you okay? I thought I saw something," she stammered, her hand shaking as she pointed to the gurney. There was movement. "I swear something was under the sheet." Ben's expression softened slightly, though the tension in his posture showed he was far from relaxed. He walked over to the gurney, hesitating for a second before pulling the sheet off. "Maybe it was just settling," Ben offered, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. He gave Riley's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Come on, let's head back upstairs. This place is starting to get to me too." Riley nodded, grateful for his presence, and they made their way back toward the stairwell as they passed the cold steel drawers lining the walls. Riley thought she heard faint scratching sounds from one of them. She stopped, turning back, but Ben gently pulled her away. "Let's get out of here," he said, his tone firm. The scratching sounds faded as they ascended the stairs, leaving only the unnerving silence behind. While Ben and Riley were making their way out of the basement, Alice had reached the 3rd floor, where the psychiatric wing was located. The air here felt different, heavier, colder, and filled with a strange, almost tangible tension. Each step felt like a violation, as though she were trespassing on forbidden ground. The hallway stretched out before her, lined with doorways that led into padded cells, some with the doors ajar, others firmly shut. Most of the walls bore scratch marks, some spelling out words that had long since faded, leaving only faint impressions of frantic desperation. As Alice moved deeper into the wing, she saw a cell with its door wide open. She approached cautiously, her flashlight revealing an old straitjacket crumpled on the floor, stained and torn. The walls were covered in words scratched so deep that some paint had peeled away, revealing the stone beneath. She tilted her head, trying to read the faint markings. "Shadow Man. Don't look into his eyes. He's always watching." A chill ran down her spine. She turned, intent on leaving the cell, when her flashlight flickered. She shook it, cursing softly. The light steadied for a moment, but when she looked back into the hall, her heart nearly stopped. At the far end of the corridor stood a figure, tall, gaunt, dressed in a filthy hospital gown, his head tilted to one side in an unnatural angle. His eyes were hollow, lifeless, and his face was twisted into a grin that made her stomach twist with fear. She recognized the figure from the hospital's records. Dr. Hartwell. Alice froze, her blood turning to ice. The figure took a step toward her, his bare feet dragging against the floor. She turned and fled, her footsteps echoing down the hall as she sprinted away, her flashlight flickering wildly. She glanced back, and the figure was gone. She barely slowed until she reached the stairwell, where she slumped against the wall, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to calm down, to steady her breathing. She picked up her walkie-talkie, her voice barely a whisper. "Riley, Ben. I saw him, Dr. Hartwell." The static-filled reply came after a long pause. "We're on our way up," Ben replied, his voice strained. "Stay where you are." They gathered in the hospital's central waiting area, each visibly shaken. Ben and Riley exchanged nervous glances, and Alice could see that they, too, had experienced something they couldn't explain. Alice recounted her encounter, describing Dr. Hartwell's appearance. The way he had seemed to watch her, as though sizing her up. Riley shared her experience in the morgue. The gurney that seemed to move on its own. The scratching sounds from the metal drawers. Ben, though reluctant at first, admitted to hearing children's laughter in the hallway and seeing a shadow dart through the door. "It's like the whole place is alive," Alice said softly. "It's like it's watching us." Riley shivered. "I want to get out of here." Alice's mind raced. Part of her was terrified, wanting nothing more than to escape. But another part, the part that had brought her here in the first place, felt drawn to the hospital's secrets, the mystery it held. "We should at least document what we've seen," she said. "People need to know what's really here. We're so close." Riley shook her head, but Ben nodded, looking more resigned than anything. "Fine, but we stay together this time. No more splitting up." They agreed, each gripping their flashlights and cameras tightly as they prepared to continue their exploration. The silence around them felt thick, pressing against their ears, and they could almost feel the hospital's walls leaning in, as if the building itself was aware of their presence. They set up in the waiting area, gathering around a dusty, broken-down reception desk. Alice placed the spirit box on the counter, her hands steady despite the trembling she felt inside. They turned it on, and the device crackled to life, filling the room with a loud hum of static. Alice cleared her throat. Is anyone here with us?" For a long moment, there was only static. And then a faint, garbled voice came through. "Help us!" Riley's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" Lice nodded, swallowing hard. Who needs help?" The spirit box crackled again, the voice growing louder, clearer. "Lost. Trapped." The lights in the hallway flickered, and the air grew colder, as though a heavy, oppressive force had settled around them. Ben shifted uncomfortably, glancing over his shoulder. "We should get out of here." But Alice pressed on. "Why are you here? Why can't you leave?" The spirit box sputtered, filling the silence with static. Before a new voice came through, a voice that was deep, calm, and unsettlingly familiar. "Because I won't let them." Alice's breath hitched as she recognized the voice. It was Dr. Hartwell's. The lights flickered again, and the shadows in the hallway seemed to grow longer, stretching toward them like skeletal hands. Riley let out a small gasp, clutching Ben's arm as the darkness crept closer, encircling them. Alice's heart raced as she asked one last question, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" The spirit box crackled, and Dr. Hartwell's voice came through, cold and calm. "I want you." The shadows closed in, and the hospital seemed to groan, as though the walls themselves were alive, shifting, trying to trap them. The spirit box went silent, leaving only the oppressive darkness and the echo of Dr. Hartwell's words hanging in the air.